The share of intermodal transport has been growing substantially in the last couple of years and will keep growing in the next couple of years. AMEVA will follow and support that trend by investing in intermodal railcars and additional equipment for the industry. The future of rail freight is driven by digitization. It will bring more safety, more performance. Digitization will help us to improve transport visibility. It will enable us to improve the turnaround time, trigger condition-based maintenance, and predictive maintenance. Considering the EU Green Deal targets, rail freight has a card to play, and AMEVA will support our industry. With more than 3,000 intermodal railcars in our fleet, we will be well over 5,000 intermodal railcars in the next 3 years. And we'll keep investing into that segment in order to provide safer and more reliable supply chain for our customers.
Urban rail's power transportation and development of a city. Today, ICT is the driving force behind the growth of urban rail transit that offers safer mobility, more efficient operations, and improved services. Huawei is currently the only solution provider in the transportation industry that can both integrate new ICT such as cloud, AI, IoT, big data, ICP, video and GIS technologies, as well as streamlined clouds, pipes, and devices. Huawei is continuously promoting wider ICT application in the industry. Huawei's Urban Rail Cloud solution provides a platform to support metro services. It represents a solid foundation for our innovation while ensuring secure and efficient operations. Centralized management increases resource utilization by 40% and simplifies O&M. As such, we can invest more resources and energy into service innovation, allowing Hohhot Metro to achieve the best management quality. We are striving to build a Hohhot Metro into a digital benchmark for the industry. The Urban Rail Cloud for Hohhot Metro supports production businesses, as well as internal and external services. Each service has specific requirements, for example, needing different levels of resource security. Therefore, implementation can be challenging. During project delivery processes, such as design, verification, and implementation, we held multiple on-site meetings for industry experts to discuss and refine the solutions. We also performed strict testing on a test platform established by Horinger, ensuring stable and compliant services on the cloud platform. The process showcased Huawei's leading technical capabilities in urban rail cloud delivery, positioning the project as a reference point for other such projects in the industry. In 2013, Zhengzhou Metro and Huawei started building the world's first LTE-based urban rail line. Since then, joint efforts in metro digitalization have been made by the two parties. On May 20th, 2019, Zhengzhou Metro opened Line 5 and simultaneously launched the AFC Network Control Center. Based on Huawei's Urban Rail Cloud, the ANCC works in sync with the Zhengzhou LV Chongtong bus cards and all-in-one cards issued by the Ministry of Transport. Passengers enjoy a convenient travel experience by scanning QR codes to enter and exit metro station. At the same time, Huawei's solution provides robust capacity for expansion and upgrade. In the future, Zhengzhou Metro plans on expanding to 21 metro lines with the capacity to serve 18 million passengers and 45 million transactions. Huawei's Urban Rail Cloud solution centrally manages computing, network storage, and security on the NOCC cloud platform, increasing resource utilization by 30%. The solution leverages virtualization technologies to merge multiple physical networks into one. It also reduces the number of devices and facilitates more efficient O&M. The NOCC cloud platform converges service data and provides platform support for smart metro service application. On May 20th, 2019, Shenzhen Metro and Huawei
systems. In industrial facilities across Europe, UNIFE members are involved in a diverse set of activities. From the development and production of trains, metros, trams, and locomotives, as well as components of rolling stock to rail signaling, energy, and infrastructure equipment. The European rail supply industry employs approximately 400,000 individuals across the EU. With absolute sales of 47 billion euro, we are the global leader for rail equipment. As an innovative industry, investing significantly in research and development and digitalization, and fully involved in the Shift to Rail joint undertaking, European rail suppliers have developed some of the most important innovations in the sector, including the European Rail Traffic Management System, driverless metro systems, and the modern very high-speed train. These innovations have reduced travel times and traffic congestion and boosted mobility all over the world in an environmentally friendly way. UNIFE is the platform for the industry and advocates for policies that will help grow rail transport and boost world competitiveness of the European rail supply industry. At an EU level, this means securing funds for rail projects, including research and development, and pushing for better access for European companies globally. Contributing to the effort to create a single European railway area, UNIFE provides its members with a direct channel to the EU Agency for Railways, as well as standardization organizations such as ISO and Sensenelec, in order to simplify the rail system and promote European standards abroad. Furthermore, UNIFE plays an active role in collaborative European rail research, coordinating EU research projects for the development of the next-generation rail system. UNIFE's activities will continue to promote a political, regulatory, and financial framework that will benefit European rail suppliers, their customers, as well as freight forwarders and passengers.
लेकिन ये बस एक कहानी नहीं है। हर मोड़ और हर क्लिक के बाद नए दौर शुरू होंगे। मैं उसका हिस्सा बनना चाहता हूँ।
Of opportunities where technology is increasing our ability to shape the future every day. And with a strong focus on sustainability, we want to lead the way in our industry by creating smart and sustainable urban environments. Our cities grow, infrastructure is transforming, everything becomes connected. That's why at Kohon, we use the power of technology to create value-adding services for sustainable success with our customers.
On meistä kiinni, miten kaupungit kehittyvät.
We are curious. We collaborate. And together, we create the best people flow experience.
Podemos hacer que nuestras ciudades sean lugares más inteligentes y más sostenibles en los que vivir. Haga suyo ese propósito y no estará solo.
More than 60,000 Kone professionals serving 500,000 customers. Over 4 billion people living in urban areas. One mission: to improve the flow of urban life.
हम मिलकर दुनिया में बदलाव ला सकते हैं. ये है हमारी कहानी.
This is our story.
这是您的故事。
Bienvenue sur Spin-Up Stations, l'application intelligente et internationale pour optimiser la performance climatique et financière de votre gare. Spin-Up vous permet d'évaluer de façon intégrée les performances sécuritaires, managériales, énergétiques et environnementales de votre gare. Prenez place et bienvenue à bord. Pour débuter votre auto-évaluation, cliquez sur le bouton plus en bas à gauche de l'écran qui permet d'ajouter une nouvelle gare. Entrez le nom de la gare concernée ainsi que son adresse. De quel type de gare s'agit-il? Une gare de bus? De métro? Disons qu'ici, il s'agit d'une gare de train. Une fois votre nouvelle gare introduite, vous pouvez déjà commencer à compléter votre évaluation. Démarrez en répondant au questionnaire général. Ces questions concernent et impactent l'ensemble de la gare. Désormais, il s'agit de reconstituer la gare élément par élément et niveau par niveau, aussi précisément que possible afin de bénéficier des résultats et recommandations les plus proches de vos performances réelles. À la clé, vous recevez le résultat des performances visualisées en spider charts par géographie, par élément de géographie et niveau d'intervention. Ces données vous permettent de calculer le coût de la défaillance et le budget nécessaire à la remédiation. Des recommandations générales qui vous permettent d'adapter la performance de la gare.
So we're just waiting for one or two last-minute arrivals back into the room, and then we'll make a start. Apologies to those online who were sitting, waiting to start again on the hour. We had a couple of little technical niggles we had to sort out, so we preferred to start a little later. So just while people here in the room are settling down, invite you to take part, of course, in this final round table, which is focusing on the regions. Of course, the 6 regions of the UIC, but here we are now in the Americas, where we can say good morning to not only to Baltimore, but to the rest of the United States as well. And we leave this session in the very capable hands of a gentleman who you saw yesterday, Anson Jack, Emeritus Professor from the University of Birmingham, a former colleague of mine back in the dim and distant British Railways days. And Anson is going to take us through this first session about rail freight in America, and then we'll have a more global perspective about growing railway services generically across America in the second roundtable as well. So Anson, I know you're there. I can't see you, but I do know you're there.
I can see you.
Oh, can you? Oh, that's lovely. How nice for you. I'll hand over to you, Anson. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, and good afternoon to everyone in Paris, and but in particular, good morning to our friends in America, who I will introduce in a minute. This afternoon's session, or the next hour and 40 minutes, is split into 2. We have the first panel, who I'll introduce in a second, who are going to talk about a bright future for American rail freight. And the second panel will be a vision to grow rail services across America. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the first panel, which consists of Jeff Moller, who's the Assistant Vice President for Transportation and Systems and Practices, Safety and Operations at the Association of American Railroads. Mr. Scott Cummings, and a particular welcome to him because he is in Colorado, so it's very early in the morning for him, who is Assistant Vice President for Research and Innovation at TTCI. Good morning, Scott. Then Ms. Caroline Healey, who's Executive Vice President and General Counsel for the Railway Association of Canada. And finally, Engineer Jorge Kohon, and apologies if I didn't get your name absolutely right, from the Latin American Railway Association. Each of the speakers has a presentation for you, which will last, I hope, no more than 10 minutes. And at the end of that session, we will have a few questions for each of them. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jeff Moller of AAR for his presentation. Thank you, Jeff. And I think you're on silent at the moment. I think you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, that was the first thing I did. Thank you, Anson. I said, can you hear me? So here we go. Yes, place the first slide up, if you will, and then we'll get started. And while we're waiting for that, there you go. Just a few points of facts in the United States. Most of you are familiar, but some may not be that, most of our networks are privately owned. The same company that operates the trains owns the track and so forth. In the United States, we've got 7 major railroads with 382,000 route kilometers. There's not a whole lot of government funding. We have about 1.5 million rail cars, about 31,000 locomotives. We operate seamlessly across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, except for customs, of course. And, in the last 30 years, railroads have spent about $25 billion, that's with a B, dollars a year on capital expenditures, investments, and so forth. Next slide, please. And of course, whoops, I think we went too far there. If we go back one. there you go. Yeah, obviously safety is critical to our industry. So here's a quick sketch of train accidents, which is a very overarching metric for the whole industry. We've had good progress. You'll note there's a little blip there around 2002. Obviously, there could be many causes for that, but one of them is that our retirement program changed at that time. It used to be age 62, you could retire with full benefits if you had 30 years. That was changed to age 60 at that point. So we literally hired thousands of new people in a very short period of time. And so perhaps our safety performance reflects that. But obviously the trends continue well. We are audited by the federal government. A train accident currently is defined as any incident involving damage to railroad equipment at more than $11,200. That's a relatively low threshold, so it captures much of what we do out there. So we're very proud of our performance. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some interesting emerging technologies. Unlike many of you, we're not blessed with an extensive network of electrification. We did have some. There was electrification in the Washington to New York area and also west to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. That was built starting in the 1930s. Some of that still exists, but it's almost 100%. Well, it is 100% operated for Amtrak and commuter trains at the moment. So there isn't any real extensive freight electrification. There's some minor bits and pieces here, but so, with 382,000 track kilometers, that's a pretty heavy undertaking. So we're looking at other options. So on the upper left there, you can see an image of a emerging hydrogen locomotive. Canadian Pacific a year ago announced that they were going to take a 15 or 20-year-old locomotive, remove its innards and change it to operate on a hydrogen fuel cell. On the bottom left, that's an image of the device that is being used. Since then, in cooperation with one of the provinces there, CP received a $15 million matching grant. So now they're going to do another road locomotive like this, but also a switching locomotive. But not only the locomotives, a major challenge of this, of course, is the infrastructure to fuel the locomotives. So CP is also developing 2 hydrogen fuel stations in Alberta. One is going to be powered by solar and the other by shale gas. And, the first locomotive is expected to be operating on its own power before the end of the year, with a lot of testing going on thereafter. Another interesting development is on the upper right. It's the so-called FLX drive. This looks very much like a standard freight locomotive, but instead of a diesel engine and generator and so forth, it has a bank of batteries. The particular locomotive had a 2.4 megawatt hour capacity, which translates to me, it can produce the same horsepower as a standard freight diesel locomotive for 30 or 40 minutes until the batteries are depleted. The batteries can be recharged in 2 ways. One is to plug them in like the common Prius that we all see, or it can also regenerate electricity going downhill in the form of braking. Most diesel electric locomotives have dynamic brakes that basically just waste that energy by blowing it out the top as heat. But in this case, the batteries can be recharged and also help control the speed of the train. This first test bed isn't really ready for production. It doesn't have enough horsepower or battery power if it can only operate for, say, 30 or 40 minutes. But it was tested for several months in Southern California on a territory that had 2 flat areas plus a mountain range in the middle. And it did well enough that the next iteration is currently under development, which will more than double the capacity to 7 megawatt hours. And in fact, a couple of railroads have already purchased some for further testing. One is Royal Hill in Australia, and also CN is going to be using it in its ore operations in Upper Michigan, or Minnesota. So interesting development. Then on the bottom right is an image of a 25 or 30-year-old passenger locomotive with a standard diesel engine that's common throughout the world, but it's been reconfigured with a catalytic converter and also what we call DEF, or diesel engine fuel. So it has an after treatment system. So that's an interesting development, because currently many of these older locomotives were just being discarded because they couldn't comply with the emissions requirements. It's important to note that our competition isn't standing still. Just read the other day that Total Energies, a French company, had signed an agreement with Daimler Truck to develop a hydrogen production and distribution center throughout EU. So our trucking friends aren't standing by, and within the next couple of years, they're going to be moving ahead very quickly as well. Next slide. I know we're going to be a little short on time, so I'll just skip quickly over this. But the point I wanted to make here is that, there are examples of excellent cooperation between passenger and freight operations. Remember, most of the freight or the rail network is owned and operated by freight railroads here. But here's an example in the San Francisco Bay Area that's been around for about 30 years now. You can see in the picture on the right, one of the passenger trains next to a freight locomotive. And this is a 240-kilometer route mile. It handles 22 regional trains, 4 long-distance Amtrak trains, intermixed with a lot of freight. So a lot of improvements were funded by the public to allow this capacity to succeed. So we'll move on to our last slide here. Another major model for us is what we call public-private partnerships. Try to say that quickly 3 times. Oh, can you advance the slide, please? And while we're waiting for that, there's 2 major ones that I'm touching on. One is the Chicago CREATE project, that stands for Chicago Regional Environmental and Transportation Efficiency Program. That's quite a mouthful, but on the left there, you can see an example where the lower track has been depressed and a new bridge has been built where those tracks used to cross at grade, creating incredible amounts of delay if you've got passenger and freight trains trying to get across at the same time and so forth. So there are more than 70 projects, $4.6 billion of investment. Imagine getting 6 major railroads, plus Amtrak, plus the commuter agency Metra, the state of Illinois, the county and the city of Chicago and so forth to agree on approaching this. It's quite an undertaking. Basically, the railroads say we'll pay for our benefits and the public pays for theirs, and our benefits are defined as reductions in train delay. And then on the right is another example, the Alameda Corridor. When I worked out in Los Angeles in the 70s, there were 3 separate railroads going down to the ports of LA Long Beach, which are, of course, the largest ports in North America. And you can imagine the number of level crossings and the delays and congestion and so forth. And so about 25 years ago, the parties got together and took one of those 3 lines and depressed it. You can see the image on the right there. The next time you fly into Los Angeles, a few minutes before touchdown, look out the window and you'll notice that very distinctive trench there with the beams across the top holding it apart. And, so that, that's a 20-mile length of track, no grade crossings. They're all, bridges overhead and so forth, a major development. And that was funded by taxes on each container that are shipped through that thing. So it's been very successful, so successful, in fact, that they're already expanding that to the east. This particular route goes from the port to downtown Los Angeles. And then, of course, the tracks from there would steer east to carry the traffic to the rest of the United States. So I'll stop there, and thanks for your kind attention.
Anson, I think you're on mute.
Thank you for that, returning the compliment. Thank you, Jeff. I think the audience have already shown their appreciation through applause, but thank you once again. Now, moving on without further ado to Scott Cummings, who is speaking to us from, I think, Pueblo in Colorado. Over to you, Scott.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Anson, and thank you to UIC for inviting me to take part in this discussion. So if we could go to the first slide. We'll start by examining some of the challenges and advantages enjoyed by freight rail in North America. As we all know, and as Jeff just pointed out, railroading is a capital-intensive undertaking. There are other competing transportation modes have much lower capital investment needs. We have the burden of a regulatory structure that's been established over many, many decades. So the best way to ensure safety of operations 50 years ago is almost certainly not the same as today. Yet it can be a challenge to move away from prescriptive regulation towards performance-based rules. The mix of commodities hauled changes both seasonally and from year to year. So we must be sufficiently nimble to adjust with these changes, and it can be difficult to sustain a skilled workforce through such changes. Interchange points, ports, and yards can become operational bottlenecks when we experience anything out of the ordinary, such as hiccups in the economy or extreme weather events. And we certainly experience challenges with extreme weather, most notably the recent flooding in Canada that temporarily isolated Vancouver from the rest of Canada and the US. The flip side of this coin is that we do have economic advantages. We already own the land on which the tracks are constructed. And we have not only a fuel efficiency advantage, but also a safety advantage over other competing forms of freight transportation. Our workforce must not only be able to handle fluctuations in the business, but also technological changes that are enabling us to be more effective and more efficient in how we control trains and how we find and fix items in need of maintenance. When Mother Nature strikes, railroads have an advantage in being self-sufficient in our abilities to repair our infrastructure on a timeline that the business dictates. Next slide, please. Many of the challenges and advantages in the North American freight railroading environment are shared by other freight railroading systems around the world. However, the careful dance between cooperation and competition is somewhat unique in North America. Freight railroading in North America involves publicly traded corporations that are entrusted with shareholder funds. And by design, there is intense competition for business between geographically overlapping railroads. Prices and terms of service are subject to antitrust laws, which can restrict communications on these topics between competitors. On the other hand, the nature of an interchange system requires cooperation to define standards on issues such as the rolling stock. Any safety challenge observed on one railroad brings potential for increased oversight to all railroads and generally disrupts the public's positive view of our industry. There are multiple examples where railroads have worked cooperatively to prove out the uses of technology to bring about safer and more efficient operations. Likewise, with freight cars traveling on multiple railroads on their way from origin to destination, the sharing of data between entities has become a critical factor in keeping the system fluid. This includes sharing data related to car repairs, but also sharing data related to train inspections and wayside detectors. And there's enough commonality in the problems faced by individual railroads that an industry-wide research program is funded by all AAR members to the benefit of railroads within North America and indirectly to railroads elsewhere in the world. Railroads also act in unison to address threats to industry market share. An example of this is pointing out the inherent safety concerns associated with proposals to use autonomous platoon trucks on the same highways with passenger vehicles. Next slide, please. One area in which North American freight railroading has a long history of success is timely adoption of critical technologies. Suppliers are very creative with proposing solutions to obstacles facing railroads, and it can leave railroads with the dilemma of trying to determine which solutions they should pursue. To help in this regard, the industry's research program provides objective assessment of new technologies. Researchers work with industry representatives to define the direction and goals of the research, then execute the plans using teams of subject matter experts and specialized tools and facilities. But identifying a good technical solution to a problem is only half the battle. The solution must also fit the business case and provide good value relative to its cost. There are a number of historical and current examples where timely technology adoption not only directly benefited the railroads and their customers, but also acted to enable additional technological advances. For example, automatic equipment identification. So you can see that in the photo in the bottom right-hand side of the slide. So by associating a particular car with its data recorded by various wayside detectors, far more targeted car repairs have been made possible. Another example is serialized components. That's on the photo on the left. By keeping track of where each component is installed on a freight car, we can now be far more effective in analyzing life cycle performance, and we can conduct much faster and more targeted product recalls should there be an issue with manufacturing. A couple of other examples. One is machine vision inspection. So by using cameras and automated algorithms to inspect freight cars, we're beginning to have repeatable, trendable evaluations of rolling stock health under conditions that are impractical to replicate on a stationary train. For example, full buff or full draft positioning. One last example is alternative broken rail detection. So this will allow moving block train control, and that will increase capacity and allow us to have enhanced detection of rail breaks compared to a simple signal system. Next slide. Thank you. So we're working hard to incorporate technologies to reduce variation and optimize our efforts. So-called energy management systems can not only determine the most fuel-efficient way to operate a given train over a given route, but they can also be geared towards optimizing coupler forces and reducing some of the variation in train handling that's inherent with the use of different locomotive engineers. Precision scheduled railroading is a term we hear frequently in North America in recent years. One of the core tenets is to provide consistent, reliable, and predictable service between any two locations. Previously, and to a lesser degree still today, skilled labor devotes a large percentage of their time to finding the components in need of attention among the vast majority that are healthy and in a good state of repair. We're increasingly using more automation in our inspection and fault detection. For rolling stock, this is accomplished through wayside detection and machine vision. For track and other fixed infrastructure, this is accomplished by outfitting high rail vehicles and locomotives with cameras, accelerometers, LiDAR, and even X-rays. These improved methods of inspection and fault detection hold great potential for reducing track mileage of slow orders and the number of unscheduled train stops. They are allowing, or will soon allow, our skilled labor forces to optimize their efforts on performing comprehensive troubleshooting and maintenance, fixing rather than finding. The adoption of critical technologies is making us safer, more reliable, and more efficient. So to answer the question at hand, is there a bright future for American rail freight? Absolutely, and it's already underway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. And again, I'm sure you can't hear the appreciation from the floor, but everyone appreciates the presentation you've just given. Without further ado, we will move on to Caroline Healey, who is speaking to us from Canada. Welcome to Caroline. And would you like to give us your presentation, please?
Sure. Thank you, Professor Jack. Good morning from chilly Montreal, Canada. Thank you for the invitation. In my presentation, before going into today's theme, which is the future of American rail freight, I'll start with a quick overview of the current impact of Canada's railways, focus on our national freight portfolio and Class 1 freight activity, and finish up with Canadian economic outlook and what's next for freight rail in Canada. So the Railway Association of Canada was created in 1917 and was first established to ensure the efficient movement of troops and supplies during the First World War. So the association has advocated on behalf of Canada's rail sector for more than 100 years now. And at the association, we really define ourselves as the voice of the rail industry in Canada. We represent close to 120 freight and passenger railway companies, as well as rail suppliers and service providers. Our railway members complete more than 100 million passenger trips and move approximately 320 billion Canadian dollars worth of goods across our country each year, with a freight rail moving 50% of exported goods. We're not shy to say that with a network spanning nearly 43,000 route kilometers across Canada and several points in the United States, the association's members are the backbone of Canada's transportation system. Our members employ close to 33,000 Canadians in railway operations, technology, safety, security, and leadership positions, and the rail industry supports more than 180,000 jobs in Canada. And this productive workforce moves close to 70% of all surface goods and half of the nation's exports every year, delivering Canada's products to the country and the world. And as today's panel focuses freight, just to give you an idea of the Canadian freight rail profile or activity, it is comprised of the two major Canadian class ones, Canadian National Railway or CN and Canadian Pacific Railway, CP, some US class ones having activities in Canada, and approximately 45 short lines. So quick numbers. Our freight members paid close to 2 billion Canadian dollars in taxes in 2020. They moved 5.5 million carloads and invested $2.3 billion in private capital investment. And out of this $2.3 billion, approximately half of it goes in track and right-of-way maintenance. But it's worth noting that in recent years, about 1/4 of investments have been dedicated to rolling stock, including the acquisition of modern fuel-efficient locomotives and retrofitting existing locomotives to improve fuel efficiency and reduce emissions. The figure on the right-hand side shows the Canadian freight rail trade map. So this map is also using 2020 data. So as mentioned, our members move over half of the country's exports by volume, and railways move more intercity freight than any other mode of transportation in Canada. So some trade patterns here to note on the map. Significant shipments of Western Canadian grain move through ports on the West Coast and Thunder Bay. Canadian coal is primarily exported through the West Coast. For metal and minerals, many shipments are within North America. For the automotive sector, there are significant domestic and transborder shipments of North American products produced of vehicles, and imports are going through Vancouver and Halifax. And as mentioned earlier, railways bring around 320 billion Canadian dollar worth of goods to market each year. Next slide, please. This slide represents the originated carload profile by commodity in 2020. There were significant changes in 2020 compared to previous years, owing in part to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Demands for Canada's agricultural products remained strong, while on the other hand, there was a global container shortage affecting intermodal shipments. Most automotive manufacturers were shut down for approximately 2 months, and the demand for energy fell significantly. The largest increases in 2020 were agriculture and minerals, and the largest decreases were fuels and chemicals, machinery and automotive, and coal. And for the trend over the past decade, intermodal is the fastest growing category, having more than doubled over the past decade. Next slide, please. This figure shows the Canadian Class 1 revenue ton kilometers for 2019, 2020, and 2021. We can see that they started off the first quarter of 2021 strong, above the 2019 levels. If we look at Q2 of 2021, the revenue ton kilometers or RTKs were above 2020 levels in every week. However, Q2 of 2020 was the period most significantly impacted by COVID-19. In 2021, weekly RTKs continuously fell throughout the second quarter, especially in the final week as the impacts of the wildfires in the western part of Canada began to take hold. In Q3 of 2021, the wildfires in the western part of Canada caused RTKs to drop significantly for the weeks beginning June 27th, July 4th, and July 11th. So overall, Q3 of 2021 were 2% below 2020 levels and 9% below 2019 levels. And now, if we look at the present Q4 of 2021, the current floodings and mudslides, as Scott alluded to in his presentation, still in the western part of Canada and British Columbia, will have an impact on Q4. RTKs fell by 12% last week and by 10% the week prior, which is significant. One of the contributing factors is that the busiest port in Canada, the Port of Vancouver, with rail connections to the major carriers, is located in this area. And finally, If we look at this year-to-date performance by commodity compared to last year, there is an increase in every commodity except grain, where it's quite stable, with even a slight decrease. But it is important to note that 2020 was a record year due to exceptional crop season and investment in larger hopper cars. So commodities are mostly back to their pre-pandemic levels. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of a Canadian economic outlook, if we first look at the state of the Canadian economy, the graph on the left shows us that by August 2021, most key economic indicators...
We just have one more minute, Caroline.
Oh, okay.
If that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure. So most key economic indicators had recovered to pre-pandemic levels. So I'll just go quickly to the second graph. So in terms of forecast, you see that the GDP is expected to grow in 2021 and 2022. So same for all of the other indicators. So I'll just go now. In terms of economic outlook, this is encouraging news for Canadian economy, and freight rail will benefit from that. So just with the pandemic, the consumption patterns of goods changed. We see more online purchases, more deliveries, and this has a direct impact on the transportation of goods. This is also an increase in consumer demand and spending for goods in North America, with a worldwide trend of buying more locally, and this puts a lot of pressure on the supply chain. But one of the silver linings of pandemic and recent natural disasters in Canada is that they both revealed to Canadians how essential freight rail is in their day-to-day lives, as probably most of what we have on our desk right now has been transported by rail at some point. But more importantly, it revealed how it is crucial for the supply of our basic essential goods, such as grain, fuel, and food. So now keeping the supply chain running smoothly and efficiently is a priority in Canada, and rail, with its continued great safety record year after year, despite increase in traffic. And if we add to that the great environmental footprint, capacity to adapt quickly and being nimble, if we just take the current flooding situation in British Columbia, despite the huge damages to rail infrastructure, the major freight carriers were back in service within 10 days only. So furthermore, there are all the recent innovations to render rail even more safe, environmentally sustainable, and productive. So if we take all those elements combined, it well positions freight rail as a key player in the future of supply chain. So consequently, we think the future of freight rail in Canada is bright and that it's full of opportunities. That being said, it doesn't go without challenges. Like many industries worldwide, Canadian rail industry is facing...
I'll have to hurry you, please, Caroline.
Yeah. I'm finishing up right now. So just like the challenges. So Canadian rail industry is facing skills and labor shortage. Also, despite the long distances in Canada and the great environmental footprint of rail, studies shows us that trucking remains the preferred choice of shippers in many instances, mostly for cost, customer reasons, and more recently due to the increase in customer demand capacity. So as I mentioned at the outset of the presentation, rail is one of the most capital-intensive industries, with $2.6 billion in private capital investment in 2020 alone.
I'm going to have to finish you because we've overrun by several minutes now.
Okay, so I'll just finish up.
Thank you very much indeed for what you've said, and we'll come back to you with a question.
Yeah, sure.
If we have time.
Yeah.
Could I just briefly mention to those colleagues who've joined for the next panel session?
I'm sorry.
The UIC Symposium was unfortunately running 15 minutes late. So we are unfortunately running just over 15 minutes late at the moment. So I hope it's okay with you to bear with us. We have one more speaker as the first panel, Mr. Jorge Kohon, who is going to talk to us about the perspective from South America. So over to you, Jorge.
Thank you very much, Anson. Thank you, UIC, for inviting us to this in the name of the Association of Latin American Railways, to participate in this UIC Symposium. If we go directly to slide 3, if possible. Good. No, one less, please. The previous one, that's one. let me start by saying, let me try to explain you what's going on in Latin America in the freight services. And on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see that the Latin America and the Caribbeans have 41 freight operators. 30 of them are privately managed and 11 are publicly managed. If we see the map and walk it clockwise, we can see that Chile has 5 operators, Bolivia 2, Peru 2, Colombia 2, Costa Rica 1, Mexico has 7, Cuba, Panama, and Venezuela has 1, Brazil has 12, Uruguay has 1, and Argentina has 6. On the right-hand side of the slide, the blue bars indicate what happened with traffic growth in terms of tons in the last 20 years. Tons grew 115% between 1999 and 2018, which means an annual compound growth of 4%. And ton kilometers grew even more. Ton kilometers grew 160%, which made an excellent performance of 5% compound annual growth. Privately managed companies move 95% of the Latin American freight, and the remaining 5 railroads. Next, please. On the top left, it is indicated that Brazil and Mexico provided 89% of the total tons transported in 2018. The remaining 11% is transported by the rest of the countries, being Colombia and Argentina, the 2 more important of this group. On the left-hand side, it is said that the concentrated mining constituted more than 60% of the total tonnage transported. The big circle on the right indicates that in 2018, 61% of the tonnage belonged to concentrated mining. This is mostly iron ore and also coal. And the rest of all the products under the name of general freights, that includes grains, construction materials, fuel, sugar, and containers, represent the remaining 39%. So freight in Latin America is 60%, in round numbers, 60% concentrated mining and 40% the rest of the traffics. On the bottom left, it is indicated the participation of rail against road countries. Mexico has a participation of rail of 25%, Colombia 20%, Brazil 19%, and there's a number of countries like Chile, Peru, and Argentina that have a participation of around 5%. On the bottom right, there's a big circle, red circle, that indicates that freight prevails in the rail long-distance network. Most of the long-distance network of Latin America is dedicated to freight. In terms of traffic units transported, 99.6% of the total traffic in the long-distance network belongs to freight, and only 0.4 is long-distance passengers. We are not including commuters here. Next slide, please. Our countries show differences in terms of traffic densities, and we are indicating the traffic densities in millions of ton kilometer per kilometer of line, which in practice means tons transported in each kilometer of line. Colombia, that has a small network dedicated to coal, has an extremely high density, 50 million tons per kilometer of line per year. Brazil, in average, has 20. Mexico has 5, and the other countries like Chile, Bolivia, Peru, and Argentina have less than 1 million tons per kilometer of line. On the top right, we indicate that all management models coexist in Latin America, and we have classified the management models into 3 groups. On the left part of this graph, we can see that Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, and Panama have chosen vertically integrated models. with commercial exclusivity for the operator in the territory which has been concession or is under their hands. On the right-hand side of that graph, we can see the countries that have chosen open access model or vertically integrated models with competitive access, which means that there's intramodal competition. And Chile, Uruguay, Colombia, and Peru have chosen a competitive model with intramodal competition. And in the middle between these management models is Mexico. We have chosen a vertically integrated model with competitive access, but under quite strong regulations. On the bottom left, there are some numbers that indicate the performance of the Latin American operators. And we want to compare them with the performance of the US Class 1 railroads, which have an EBT margin, earnings before tax margins, which is very high, which is more than 31%. This is the blue bar in the graph in the bottom left. There are two other bars there that indicate the EBT margin of the Latin American operators. Altogether, they have an EBT margin of nearly 20%, but the large ones have an EBT margin of 21%, the medium ones an EBT margin of 9%, and the small ones have an EBT margin of negative EBT margin of 7%. This indicates the difficulties that the small Latin American railways may have when they need to do infrastructure investments, when their tracks reach the end of their useful life and large investment needs to be done to rehabilitate rails, ballast, track fastenings, which has a cost per single kilometer of line in Latin America between $500,000 and $1 billion, which is a huge, a huge amount of money for these small railroads. On the bottom right, there's a table, and I will ask you to look to the third column, the gray column, under the heading of participation. It says that measured in traffic units, which is ton kilometer or passenger kilometers, freight represents 93.2% of the total traffic in the Latin American railroads. Passengers, including long-distance passengers and mainly commuters, which are much more important than long-distance passengers in Latin America, represent 6.8%. So Latin American rail activity is dominated by freight activity, more than 90% of the total traffic units. Next, please. What is the Latin America rail agenda for the next 10 years? Please go on. Thank you. Although there are some turbulences here and there, some turbulences in Mexico with increasing regulations and also turbulences in Argentina. In Argentina, my country, we are moving from a vertically integrated model to an open access model. In general, the freight activity looks very promising. There are two topics that can be the most relevant in the agenda. One is that in many countries, there are a strong discussion on how much commercial exclusivity and intramodal competition and open access should be in our systems. And finally, something that I have just mentioned is the long-term financial viability of small and medium-sized railways. Again, these railways can face financial difficulties when they need to take care of track investments where these tracks reach the end of their useful life. Thank you very much in the name of for your attention in the name of Association from Latin American Railways.
Thank you very much, Jorge, and thank you very much again to all of our speakers. We have a few minutes for some questions, and the first question is for Jeff Moller of the AAR. And I wanted to ask you whether you see sufficient growth in non-coal traffic to replace and maintain the financial viability of the Class 1 railroads as the world stops burning coal over whatever timescale we decide to do it.
Yeah, thanks, Anson. Yeah, for those that may not be aware, our coal traffic peaked in 2008 and has dropped 54% since then. Mostly, this coal was used for electrical generation, and natural gas prices are the main reason for that. What's interesting is that public policies in the United States have shifted, so there's been a de-emphasis on hydraulic fracturing of energy and so forth. So natural gas prices have significantly increased in recent months, and coal traffic has come back slightly, not enough to even get close to what it was before. But what's interesting is that intermodal traffic has become our number one revenue source in that period. Intermodal is, of course, more expensive, and with terminals and more energy needed to move the trains at higher speed and so forth. And our competition is not standing still. I talked about the total energy system in France, making a network of hydrogen stations, and such things will undoubtedly be coming here as well. So, yeah, challenges remain, but we are certainly working with our customers, and life should be good.
And you do see intermodal absolutely replacing coal, and growth and viability continuing for the Class 1 railroads then.
Yeah, and plus shorter distance. In the past, intermodal used to be competitive over 750 miles, but with better service and so forth, that number has dropped. I'm currently in Florida, and here the Florida East Coast runs many intermodal trains on a 350-mile segment of track very successfully, for example.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving to Scott. We heard yesterday, I'm not sure whether you were able to join us yesterday, about the growing risks associated with cyber security. And in your research capacity, do you have sufficient resources? Do you think the industry is putting sufficient resources into understanding and mitigating the risks from cybersecurity?
Yeah, Anson, it's a reasonable question, and one that really could be asked of any industry today. My company, TTCI, recently had some discussions with an external entity on the same topic. They had concern that they expressed about the potential to hack into dispatcher-controlled interlocking and cause a derailment. While this is certainly an undesirable event, the same outcome has been possible through much less sophisticated means for about 150 years. So where we really see more potential vulnerability is less on the side of individual derailments and more on the side of disrupting the supply chain by slowing or restricting train movements. So as the industry moves to more automation in our train control methods, we need to remain vigilant with suppliers that cybersecurity is at the forefront of planning and development efforts. So the industry is active in this area. And as an example, the AAR has established a committee comprised of railroaders called the Rail Information Security Committee. So the acronym is RSIC, or RISC. RISC has developed a document available for download on AAR's website, which provides baseline cybersecurity effective practices intended to supplement an organization's existing IT management processes and standards.
Okay, and do you think you have enough resources at TTCI to support the industry in that?
Well, it's not necessarily TTCI's prime driver in terms of our mission and our vision for our company. We're not necessarily cybersecurity experts.
Okay.
But certainly the industry as a whole, I think, is taking a good look at it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on to Caroline. What are the sectors in the railroad industry that you see growing? You've given us a very good economic overview. What are the key investments that are needed over the next 10 or 15 years to support that growth?
Yeah, well, I'd say most of the investments would be in the rail infrastructure itself. As we mentioned, I think Jeff mentioned it also, Scott, rail is a capital-intensive industry. And with the new economy coming up, the increase in demand, massive rail infrastructure will be needed to support with the flow of goods that are coming our way. So I'd say like investment in rail infrastructure is key for keeping up with the new economy and the supply chain.
Okay, thank you. And the final question for Jorge, and you touched on this in your talk, but I just wonder whether you could comment on what the financial viability of the small and medium-sized private railways in Latin America is, or how you see it.
It is a challenge, Anson. Large operators, concessionaires in Latin America are profitable. However, those railroads have as revenue $20–30 million per year, can cover with their own revenue the operational and maintenance cost of the rolling stock and the infrastructure, but it's difficult for them to face, as I have just said, investment costs, especially in rehabilitation. They can cover the capital cost of rolling stock, but they cannot cover the capital cost of track infrastructure. So this leads to a discussion which is taking place in Argentina and many countries about the role of the governments and the transport policies in relation to capital investments in infrastructure. I think this is a key element of the agenda on rail policy in Latin America. If in some cases, in relation to the small railroads, if this government action is not taken, the rail networks will inevitably shrink and reduce.
Okay, thank you very much, Jorge, and thank you very much to all four panelists. Could I ask the assembled people to join me in thanking them for their contribution and for answering the questions? Thank you very much indeed. I have been given permission by our leader, Mr. Fletcher, to move straight on to the second panel of the afternoon, which is still focusing on North America. And the theme of this second panel is a vision to grow rail services across America. And a very, very appropriate and a very distinguished set of panelists that we have for you. I'll just quickly introduce each of them and then invite Stephen Gardner to make his presentation first. We have Stephen Gardner, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Amtrak. We have Martin Landry, who is the Chief Commercial Officer of Via Rail in Canada. We have Mr. Paul Skoutelas, who is the President and CEO of APTA in North America. And last but no means least is Mr. Joubert Filho, who's chairman of the board of ANPTrilhos in Brazil. So a very distinguished group. And without further ado, I'll invite Stephen to up whatever you pick up when you're doing it remotely and give his presentation. And just a reminder to all the panelists, if you ask when you're ready to move to the next slide, it would help the organisers if you tell them that you want the slide moved on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anson. It's a pleasure to be with you, and good afternoon to everyone. It's great to talk about advancing a vision for growth for passenger rail in the United States. A little bit about Amtrak. We could start maybe on the first slide. Okay, so we are the intercity carrier of the United States, created by the federal government. We're a federally owned corporation, really created to consolidate the intercity passenger rail service in 1971 and serve the network of the United States. And the topic here of growth is one that we've really been focused on for about 50 years. And the really news of today is that for the first time, maybe ever in our history, we've got the resources coming to both the Department of Transportation, which administers investments for the federal government generally for transportation in the U.S., and Amtrak to act on a vision of rail growth. So it's a really exciting time for the company and for the industry in the United States. We are the U.S. operator, as I mentioned, 46-state network, about 21,000 route miles, includes everything from high-speed operations here in the Northeast Corridor to 48-hour, 2,000-mile long-distance trips that traverse a good part of the continent. So a diverse set of operations. And pre-pandemic, we're about 32.5 million riders a year on our intercity service, serving about 500 destinations and a little more than $3 billion in revenue. In addition to our own passengers, we support something on the order of about 300 million trips a year across the infrastructure that we own and operate on behalf of commuter railroads and others who use our assets. So to our next slide, the pandemic, like all of our brothers and sisters around the globe, devastated our business. We lost 96% of our traffic in the course of a month, but we have really turned the corner in terms of restoring demand across the network. Today, we're operating at about 75% of our pre-pandemic demand. We just had a very successful Thanksgiving week here in the United States, where we saw demand levels in the 80% level of our pre-pandemic levels. So we are building back our service, and that's great timing for the major investments that were just accomplished here in the United States through the work of the administration, the Biden administration, and Congress to invest in infrastructure. And that investment's bringing about $60 billion to the passenger rail business here in the United States between Amtrak and the federal government. And $30 billion of that will be for our Northeast Corridor investments, together with our state and commuter partners. And for those of you who are familiar with our network, you'll know this is the main line, really, of passenger railroading in North America between Washington, D.C. and Boston, Massachusetts. Complicated railway owned by really 4 separate owners, serving about 2,200 trains a day, about 270 million trips a year over this railway in normal times. And it's basically a Victorian railway that stemmed infrastructure from 1835 onwards and is in great need of overhaul and rehabilitation and replacement. And we've got about $30 billion coming for that effort, focused on primarily the big structures, so major bridges and tunnels, and terminals, where we've essentially filled out all the available capacity and need to upgrade capacity significantly and replace these 150-year assets to increase reliability and performance. We have a unique structure because of all the different owners and the 12 different operators that operate collectively over this network between passenger and freight, called the Northeast Corridor Commission. This is a federally created commission to bring all the owners and operators together to plan for asset improvement and reinvestment. We have a big plan called Connect 35 to basically bring this corridor up to a state of good repair, and we're working on that. That's what this $30 billion really go to, is implementing the first piece of that plan, which is really a 15-year plan. This will make a very significant a down payment on the bulk of that work. Next slide. The other piece of the investments coming to the United States passenger rail business are really for the redevelopment and expansion of our national network. And this is that 46-state network, which is, again, primarily our corridor service, which we operate together with state partners, and our long-distance trains. There's $28 billion coming to really recapitalize and modernize the assets in this network. So primarily fleet and facility upgrades. We're already halfway through a complete renewal of our fleet with our new Acela trains and ICT, our intercity train sets, that will replace our Northeast Corridor and some of our corridor trains elsewhere. And we'll begin the process of completely refleeting our long distance service. So At the end of this decade, I expect us to have really under order and under delivery fleet for an entirely new 21st century equipment profile for the company. We'll be continuing to expand our stations and upgrade them for both accessibility and customer experience. And then most excitingly, we'll be able to work with the Department of Transportation that will lead a grant program and planning process to invest in expanding corridors across the United States. Amtrak spent a lot of time developing a vision for what I'd say proper corridor network in the United States would look like that really serves the major 50 top metropolitan areas. Amtrak, since our founding in 1971, our network has changed very little, yet the United States has added 120 million people to the nation over that period of time. And that's led to a real mismatch between service levels and population in key regions, particularly the South, Southeast, Mountain West, and West. So we've put forward a vision that I think got a lot of attention and excitement around what rail can do for the future of the United States in terms of mobility, obviously addressing the critical crisis of climate and economic opportunity. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see the proposal that the Amtrak Connects Us plan put forward, which is an aggressive 15-year program of providing service up to about 160 new communities, really a growth of about 30 new corridors. And really this puts rail where, frankly, it obviously needs to be in the United States, built around places like the Atlanta, our Front Range corridor, and around Denver, expansions in the Southwest.
Could we have the next slide, please? Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Stephen.
No problem. So we've got a lot of energy and excitement and opportunity building. We go through a process with the Department of Transportation to sort of take these ideas that we've put forward and all the ideas from our state partners and host railroads to think about how this network can be expanded and improved and work together to deliver over this next decade, I think, meaningful improvements and expansions to the network. Our goal is to double Amtrak's ridership by 2040, and this is the plan that will help get us there, along with our improvements of the Northeast Corridor. So the typical story in the United States is one in which the network's sort of biggest ambition was to sort of hang on for another 5 or 10 years, and that future has really radically changed now with this investment. Allows us to take the planning efforts that have been going on for many decades and really begin the process of implementation. That implementation will be, of course, very critically dependent on the relationships we have with the various host railroads that own most of the infrastructure in the United States, on which we're a tenant, our many commuter partners who both use our assets and whose assets we use, and the supply chain and supply industry, which is going to be critical to providing the capacity needed to deliver on these improvements, along with, of course, the leadership of the federal government. So thanks very much for the time, and it's a great opportunity. All of us at Amtrak have been waiting for 50 years for the level of investment you see here before you. That's essentially over 5 years, the same amount Amtrak's received in 50. And we're really excited about the opportunity to have rail play a much bigger role in the mobility picture of the United States.
Thank you very much indeed. That's certainly given us a very positive vision for the future of rail in America or in the United States. And without further ado, we'll move to Canada and invite Martin Landry to address us on the outlook from Via Rail's point of view. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Anson, and thank you, Stephen, our big brother to the south. Happy to be here. Hopefully my voice holds up. Yesterday was a big day for Via. We unveiled our brand new train that will provide services on our busy corridor. And so we spent the day in press briefings. It was an exciting time, and really exciting time to see what's happening south of the border. And I'll share some of the thoughts of what's happening on the northern part of North America and talk a tad bit about Via Rail. So next slide, please. Not a very dissimilar story in Canada than in the US. We were created in 1977, about 5 or 6 years after Amtrak was created for a similar reason. Passenger rail operations in Canada, as in the US, was primarily one that was offshoots from rail operators focusing on freight, and they had divisions providing passenger service, and they pulled out of that market and transferred the assets to the Canadian government in our case, and the Canadian government created a company called Via Rail in 77, and we've been operating intercity and only intercity service since 1977. We're about a little over 3,000 employees. And this, again, is 2019 numbers. That's the only relevant baseline for many of us. 450 odd departures a week, a fleet of 430 cars and 73 locomotives. We do serve more than 400 communities, and the majority of our business actually looks very much like very traditional intercity traffic, high density, highly populated central Canada. So in our case, we call it the Windsor to Quebec City corridor. It's not dissimilar to the Northeast corridor. 96% of our ridership is there, and 81% of our revenue. And that is, as I said, very classic inner city type of operations. If we move to the next slide, please. Quick view of our network. Canada is a big country. We're the second largest landmass country after Russia. And we do serve communities from coast to coast to coast. And you heard me right, there is a third coast, and we operate all the way up to the Arctic Ocean, up to Churchill, Manitoba. So it's a very long, thin spine that goes across the country, linking Halifax on the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. And our mandate is to connect many of those communities, and many of them have little to no other means of transportation. And many of those are Indigenous communities, and part of our mandate is to continue to provide services to those communities. Now, if you would have taken a look at what our network looked like in 1977 and 1978, you'd see a much more robust network. And the story for Via Rail and intercity travel for most of its history since it was founded in 1978 is continued cutback from the asset transfer in the late 70s to 2014. We saw a significant decline in both number of routes that we served and the frequencies, and therefore a significant amount of trimming down, if you will. And in 2014, we decided to test the appetite of Canadians to take the train, and really focused on improving the customer experience, and we saw significant growth since 2014. And the other part of the story in Canada is what's happening in urban centers. You know, rail used to account for more than 50 million passenger segments a year after the Second World War, but since it's gone down to about 5 million passengers in 2019, but that's up from about 3.5 million in 2014. But the other story, and if you go to the next slide, is really the emergence of regional rail hubs across the country. So if you could maybe go to the next slide. Well, the next slide would show a whole bunch of bubbles, there you go, across the country. And really, we've seen very, very strong development of regional rail services in urban centers from Vancouver all the way across the country. And we think we're a very good link from all of these bubbles in order to connect the passenger who would like, and more of them show the preference for public service option. And so we link the bubbles together on our spine, and that's working out quite well. Now, as you can imagine, the network is primarily a freight-owned infrastructure. We run 97% of our services, or 97% of our network is actually owned by freight operators. And as incredible as it may sound, in Canada, freight has priority over passenger rail service. So one of the real challenges we have is the operational flexibility, or the lack of operational flexibility. And I'll give you one example. We do have a train that links Toronto to Vancouver. It is a 96-hour journey, and our record, I don't know exactly how to say it, the lateness is 46 hours. So very challenging environment, challenging our crews, challenging our passengers, and challenging on the relevancy of rail transportation. So clearly the task ahead of us is how do we lessen that dependency and find ways to gain that operational flexibility to have services that are more relevant for Canadians. If we want to move to the next slide, please. So what are we doing? And there was a theme on modal shift. And I guess the first challenge we have is we have to have a mode to shift to. And in our case, we're really focusing on shifting car traffic onto our rail network. On our busy corridor market, 87% of the traffic is actually car traffic. We developed, after the Second World War, really a car culture. Extensive highway networks were built across the country. Cities were configured really with the car as a prime means of transportation, which led to large number of suburbanization factors across the nation. And therefore, our challenge is to convince people to leave their cars behind. And so we've launched a number of initiatives to improve the service that we provide to Canadians. So one of them is our Everest project. I never like the code word Everest. It sounds like one hell of a challenge, and it is, because it's changing all of the ecosystem that our customers use to deal with us, including our back-end reservation system. It should be in operations sometime this summer. July 22nd is the target date. And that's really going to be very transformative to our passengers and how they deal with us. We have two key programs related to rolling stock. One of them is Heritage Program. The cars we run outside of our corridor services, some of them were manufactured in the 40s, and most of them in the mid-50s. So we're providing needed love for some of these cars to bring them up to more modern standards, and again, provide a more relevant journey for our passengers. The other program is the Corridor Fleet Replacement Program, which is the one we unveiled yesterday in Ottawa. This will see the replacement of all of our corridor fleet, which today is composed of multiple different car types, to a brand new platform. So we have 32 integrated push-pull train sets being delivered as we speak, and will be brought into revenue service in the fourth quarter of 2022. And the last project, and not least, is what we call high-frequency rail. I know for many of you, it's a new term. It is one that we use to capture the importance of frequency to the choice that Canadians make when they decide how they're going to move from point A to point B. So it is a project that would see us leveraging current rights of way, but to build a passenger-only infrastructure that would be electrified, allowing us to connect cities in our corridor in a operational environment that is much more conducive to bringing passengers on board and leaving their cars behind. So it'll be linking all of the communities along the way as well. It'll obviously operate on a schedule that is much more relevant to them, with far better on-time performance, which is one of the challenges we currently have as we share infrastructure with freight operators. So this project is under consideration in front of the Canadian government. The cabinet will be making a final decision on some of the options that are in front of them for the deployment. And we hope to start building out this project in the next few quarters in order to significantly change the passenger experience. Next slide, please. Which leads us to way forward, some of the headwinds. I mentioned, freight is king in Canada, and we really acknowledge the critical role of freight in the Canadian economy. But it is not a very good cohabitation environment for passenger service. which has led to the development of our HFR proposal, which will segregate passenger rail away from freight infrastructure. And the other challenge we have is this default to the automobile as the #1 choice of transportation in most regions across Canada. But there are good tailwinds. One of them is younger generations are much more focused on the environment and therefore much less rely on cars. And, when I was growing up, freedom for me anyways was wresting the car keys away from my dad and driving to my friends. And that's how we expressed our freedom. But I have 2 kids, and frankly, they don't care much about car. One of them, I don't think will ever own one. And he's looking for governments to provide public service through rail as the #1 mode of transportation. And I think that pressure will only continue to mount, and we think we're very well positioned to capture that. The other one is we have a policy in Canada providing barrier-free transportation. There is no better means of transportation for accessibility reasons than the train. And this applies not only for our busy corridor, but also right across the country. And we're currently working with the government to look at how to modernize train service in our long, thin routes as well. And the other big tailwind is really the performance of Via Rail over the 4 years preceding the pandemic. We grew our ridership by more than 32%, our revenue by more than 40%. And this was really Canadians telling authorities that they wanted train service. And I think governments are paying attention. We are quite jealous of what's happening south of the border. And we hope to mimic what Amtrak is doing, a very ambitious plan, but I think one that is extremely relevant for Canadians as well.
Is that?
That's it.
The conclusion. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that. Yes, I should have pointed that out.
Equally positive, but slightly different perspective from what we heard south of the border. Thank you very much indeed. We'll now move on to Paul Skoutelas, who is from the Chief Executive of APTA and is going to talk to us for the next 10 minutes. Thank you very much, Paul. Over to you.
Thank you, Anson, and good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with you. First of all, let me just say that it's a great pleasure to be with an impressive group of leaders as we have today for this session. And certainly you heard from my good friend and colleague, Stephen Gardner. It's exciting to hear about the prospects of Amtrak and Amtrak's expansion, long overdue, of course. And we're very confident that with Stephen at the helm, we're going to see great things emerge going forward from Amtrak. Also wonderful to share the podium here, the virtual podium with our neighbors to the north, Via Rail in Canada, and our partner to the south, ANPTrilhos in Brazil. All good works that are going on there. And certainly to extend my congratulations to UIC for the start of their centenary celebration and for putting together this session, which in our view is so timely. The title for the session, A Vision to Grow Rail Service Across America, couldn't be more apropos given the resources that are now being made available that are going to allow us to turn that vision into a reality. So the popularity of rail and the desire for more rail in the U.S. has been growing for a number of decades, certainly more than 20 years. And it's particularly true for, I would say, the urban forms of rail, passenger rail, light rail systems, streetcars, and commuter rail in particular. Over the last 20 years, we can go to the next slide that's titled Rail Popularity. You'll see that over the last 20 years, rail ridership has grown by about 52% across the country, due in large measure to the addition of new expansions of rail systems. Many new commuter rail systems have come online in that time frame of the last 20 years or so, and extensions to lines, whether they be streetcars or light rail and the like. It's interesting to note that if you look at ridership, urban ridership in terms of transport and transit in the US, it's split 50-50 between the bus mode and the rail passenger mode. So it's quite an interesting statistic. And it reflects a bit about the preferences of people and the preferences of communities. Certainly in the case of rail, transit users like rail because it's faster, clean, and generally impervious to traffic problems. City officials tend to like rail because it can make an urban area a magnet for visitors, for handling major events, for attracting new employers and developers. And having service today, having rail service that connects downtowns to an airport, in many cases has become a prerequisite for economic growth. So it's interesting to note that while the rail systems and rail popularity have grown over time and become more prevalent in the US, understanding the importance of where we are now requires a look back at least over the last 22 months, given what we've all experienced. COVID-19 did more than just bring change. It accelerated trends that were already underway, that we had seen in communities across the country dealing with urban transport delivery and planning. The pandemic exposed changing travel patterns and ridership preferences. It showed us the potential for knowledge workers to embrace technology. It revealed gaps in transport service and access in underserved neighborhoods, as well as the bias that perhaps we have seen over the last number of decades of where and how we invest in transportation infrastructure. And it caused us to examine the need for a broader, more diverse funding base, and allowed us to place greater value on some of the things that really mean much to us, the value of our time, our families, and the quality of life in our communities. It's the convergence of both of these crises and consciousness that's led us to reimagine a different post-pandemic future, a future with some new priorities, certainly, for public transport. Just 2 weeks ago, I joined U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg at the dedication of a light rail extension project in Phoenix, Arizona. And as you may know, Phoenix is one of the fastest growing urban areas in the country. We were there to celebrate the fact that this one relatively modest passenger rail project, a light rail project, would breathe new life into neighborhoods where most residents do not own a car and 1/3 live below the poverty line. It would expand transportation options and access to more economic opportunities, including jobs, education, and healthcare. It would upgrade and modernize transportation infrastructure to make mobility more reliable, resilient, and convenient. And it would reduce carbon emissions and traffic congestion for a cleaner, healthier, and more productive community. That really capsulizes what rail is achieving in America today. And it's why we're excited about what has occurred here just in the last couple of weeks, and it's the passage of new law at the federal level, the passenger rail provisions of the new $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Deal. We can move on to the next slide. This bipartisan infrastructure deal is truly historic. Steve Gardner alluded to that. The new law provides some $102 billion US for passenger and freight rail. That's a whopping increase of 6 times what the current funding levels are today. In addition to that, $107 billion for public transport generally. This is for all the urban systems, whether they be bus, rail, light rail, commuter, and the like, also is included in this legislation. So you'll see over $200 billion available as new resources over the next 5 years to invest in public transport and in passenger rail, with improvements to freight as well. It is the largest investment in passenger rail and public transport in over 50 years in the US. The new money for rail will go to modernize our rail systems and our vehicles, the fleets. It will provide many improvements that will benefit passenger and freight, as much of the existing intercity passenger rail in the US runs almost exclusively on freight track. And I think we've heard some of that same message, not only from Stephen, but from Martin as well. And it will advance rail safety for passengers and the public using innovative technologies and grade crossing improvements to achieve those goals. And it will allow us to purchase cleaner running engines and overhaul existing locomotives to reduce pollution. As you heard a moment ago from Stephen, it will make the Northeast corridor between Boston, New York, and Washington faster and more efficient, as well as improve and expand Amtrak services throughout the country. Importantly, it would also support the planning and development of other high-speed rail corridors and capital projects across the US. This is a major development for all forms of passenger rail across the country, including light rail, commuter rail, heavy metro rail, and intercity rail. It's also a great opportunity for us to make significant progress on high-speed and higher performance rail, which have always been part of our vision of what's possible in the US. We can move to the next slide. looking at the map, you'll see that these represent high-speed and high-speed performance rail projects in corridors across the U.S. They cover the Northeast, the Southeast, the Southwest, the Midwest, and of course, the West Coast of the U.S. as well. These are all projects that are planned under development in several of the states and regions and are moving forward. And as you can see from the map—
Can we have the next slide, please? I don't think it's come up yet.
Okay.
Is there anyone there listening to us? Can we have the next slide? Thank you.
That's the slide with the corridors?
Yeah.
Yep. And just to mention again, you can see they take up major parts of the U.S. in terms of where there's a presence of ongoing projects that are either in the planning or development stages. If we move on to the next slide, and these are the three examples I want to just touch on briefly of high-speed rail projects that are happening in the U.S. Do you have that slide?
Yep.
Okay. You take a look at these examples. They cover example projects that are happening right now in California and in Texas and in Florida. Not coincidentally, these are the three most populous states in the U.S. California today is somewhere around 35 million people. Texas is getting very close to about 30 million, and Florida, growing rapidly as well, is approaching about 23 million people. And each of them have projects here that I think are worth a mention. The California High-Speed Rail project is among really the country's largest infrastructure projects, maybe the world. Its price tag, when it's all said and done, will be close to $100 billion US. It will tie together some of the major cities in California: San Francisco, LA, San Diego, and others. About 120 miles are currently under construction of this 500-mile route. And by next summer, it's expected that the environmental review period will be completed and the environmental documents will be done for about 95% of the 500-mile route. That would be a major, major achievement. Moving on to Texas, Texas is proposing and has under development a new high-speed line that will be exceeding 200 miles per hour. It's a 240-mile course that will connect Dallas to Houston in less than 90 minutes with intermediate stops in the central counties of Texas, estimated to attract about 6 million riders annually. And in Florida, the 235-mile so-called Bright Line corridor, which will connect Miami to Orlando, and from Orlando on to Tampa, three of the larger cities within the state. That's under construction as well. So there's a lot of development that's already underway, even in advance of the new funding that I spoke to just a minute ago. So as you can see, it's an exciting time for public transport in the U.S., particularly so for rail development. There is a great deal of optimism in the industry. Many challenges yet to overcome, certainly getting back to some degree of normality, because the past 22 months have really taken a toll on ridership. So we need to make some recovery there that I think is happening, albeit very slowly. But our future is very much in our crossroads here. We are really focused on what we can achieve here over the next 5 years. It's critical that we demonstrate to Congress the achievements that we can make with the resources that have become available to us. And it will do so with a commitment to advancing some of the basic principles of the new mobility. They include promoting greater equity and access, positively impacting climate change, and playing the essential role in our nation's economic and recovery. That's what American public transport and American passenger rail can do. So if I can, let me just close with a brief commercial here. I'd like to invite you all to join UIC, Amtrak, the Federal Railroad Administration for an in-person conference next year in Philadelphia. It will be the 30th of March to the 1st of April, and we'll be focusing entirely on high-speed and intercity passenger rail, the challenges, the opportunities that we have, and the great potential to make great progress in this area. So I view our panel discussion today as just the start of those more productive events and discussions that we'll be seeing for passenger rail in the coming year. Again, I want to thank you for this opportunity to participate and share some of the exciting news that are happening in the States relative to passenger rail development.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Paul. And I'm sure everyone around the conference room is thanking you as we speak, but you and I can't see. I bet no one expected to be invited to America to talk about big investments in high-speed rail. that sounds really very exciting. And no doubt many people will be looking forward to that. Let's move on now to Joubert Flores, who is going to give us a presentation, again, from the South American perspective. Over to you, Joubert.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon for everyone, or good morning, depends on you are. I'm here in Brazil, it's still morning. It's a pleasure for me to be here with so important colleagues. And I'll try to give you a vision of the future of rail, particularly in Brazil. The next slide, please. I am the chairman of ANPTrilhos. ANPTrilhos is a national association that joins 100% of the passenger rail operators. And I'm also vice chairman of UIC for Latin America. My background was in Metro Rio. I served there for 45 years, 12 as executive director. The next, please. Brazil is a very big country, you know. We have 8.5 million square meters, a population of 210 million inhabitants, and 85% of these inhabitants lives in cities, are urban persons. We have 27 metropolitan regions with more than 1 million inhabitants, 17 cities with more than 1 million inhabitants, 32 cities with more than 500,000 inhabitants. It means that in 49 cities lived 30% of our population. And as you can see, you have only 1,116 kilometers of rail to serve mobility to these people. It's a very short network. Last year, with the pandemic, we just served 5.8 million passengers. Before the pandemic, it was the double, around 11. Nowadays, we are growing slowly. We have 74% of our passengers, something like 7 million passengers. It represented a loss in income around $3 billion for the operators. The next, please. As you can see, you have in Brazil 21 passenger systems. In 11 states, you have 27 states in Brazil. And we have 15 operators, 7 are private. 10 years ago, we have only 2 private operators, and nowadays we have half of the operators as private companies. In the near future, you can see in the next slide, please. We will have projects in Bahia, in the state in the Northeast, an extension of the subway line. And we are building a 23 kilometers monorail line to the suburb of Salvador. In the north of Brazil, in Ceará, you have a new line of subway and a line of light rail. In another state, in Rio Grande do Norte, you have already a light rail that we are building a second line. And in São Paulo, our big state, São Paulo represents probably half of GDP of Brazil. The capital of the state has 21 million inhabitants in the metropolitan region. You have the extension of the commuter line, line 9. We have one station to finish line 4. An extension of line 2 green that serves the financial district. Line 6 is a PPP to build a 15 underground line. And line 17 is a monorail line of 7 kilometers to serve the city airport. Next slide, please. Now talking about freight. Brazil has a little less than 30,000 kilometers for freight. Is a very short number. I listened to the previous presentation. You have a huge number of tons transported by these companies, but for sure is not enough because you have a very strong, very high production in agriculture and of others kind of products, including iron, and move this to the harbors by trucks is very expensive. So you have these 4 big projects to expand our freight lines. And now you have a new regulation that will allow people to build a line with only an authorization, not more a concession, that you can be the owner of the line and you can connect this to the big lines to export or to move your production. Next one, please. Again, talking about passengers, besides you have this so big country, we have only 2 intercity lines. And these 2 intercity lines are operated by freight lines. We have 122 new studies, and at least you have 25,000 kilometers possible to develop in the country. But the most strong possibility and probability are the next slide, please. You can see here in São Paulo that I mentioned is the big state. You have one project to connect city of Campinas to São Paulo. And in São Paulo, you have more three projects in the 4 directions surrounding the capital. This project is the more feasible and can stimulate to develop others. We have a project in the federal capital, Brasilia, to connect a city that uses people to live but work in the capital. And in Minas Gerais, you have 2 trains, two new lines. To finish, next slide, please. I believe that Brazil has a good potential because you need to develop rail systems. For a long time in the 60s, our governors believed that you can use only roads to move people and freight, and it was a mistake. Of course, you need to be connected with and integrate both in passengers and freight. And we are working hard with the government to improve the regulation because we have a fiscal difficulty to invest. But as you see, all the freight companies I mentioned are private. Half of the passenger companies are private operators. So we need to develop our regulation rules to attract this private capital. The majority of new projects are PPPs or concessions. And if you have a strong guarantee to these operations, we can attract this capital and develop our systems. So I'm here free to try to answer if you have any question. And I'd like to thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much indeed, Joubert, and thank you very much for bringing this in more or less on time with our revised schedule. We've got a few questions to put to the panelists.
Hello, Yerjan. Good afternoon, good evening. How are you?
Sorry? The first question is to Stephen Gardner, and I wanted to pick up on something that Martin Landry was saying about his son and his attitude to having a car. Are you seeing any benefit from the comparisons of carbon emissions between aviation and road and rail? And do you see that changing over time?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. It was a great presentation from Martin, and always a pleasure to be with our neighbors to the north. We do see a benefit in customer attitude for certain. We actually have had a great focus over this pandemic period on attracting new customers to the railway, and particularly our sort of under 30 age demographic. Since we had a lot more capacity and we had a lot more flexibility on pricing, we were really able to expand out our offering, and we've been able to achieve 500,000 new riders per month over this past year. These are brand new riders to Amtrak, never ridden with us before, which was pretty good given that we only had 12 million riders really this past year. And a big part of their consideration set is obviously climate, and certainly the convenience, the sort of the productivity, the generosity of the railway experience is key, and our downtown to downtown service. I completely concur with Martin on the sort of the love affair with driving is over in the United States for folks under the age of 40 for sure. And there's a real interest in the train, but it's not just that experience. There's a consciousness and awareness about climate. We've gone to printing on all of our tickets and through all of our sales channels a clear carbon calculator so that our passenger can understand the amount of CO2 emitted from the trip and the relationship to taking rail as opposed to driving or flying, and the impact on carbon as a result of that choice. So we've been trying to reinforce this in our passenger behavior, and we see folks responding to it. I think the big issue, of course, is changing the dynamics in the marketplace around the price of carbon over time. That's not something we've done yet in the United States, and the investments that are coming through this infrastructure bill will help us scale the capacity. And I think then the kind of missing piece is changing the pricing dynamics across transport modes related to carbon, and that will be a very big change if it does happen. But across our whole set of customers, we hear sustainability and climate as a major concern, and people feel good about taking the train. They understand that it's vastly superior than the other traditional modes in this respect, and they want to do what they can to help. And I think that's going to become more important, obviously, as we tackle this crisis as a globe.
Thank you. If I may, I'll build on that theme and move to a question to Paul, because it's building on the presentations you both gave about the investments that are coming up. And the question is really, with all the advantages that we've heard about around CO2, congestion relief, etc., do you see that the rail sector is getting its fair share of investment? And I suppose the $64,000 or $1 million question is, would it sustain a change in administration?
Anson, you're asking the right question here. No, there's no doubt. First of all, let me say I'm extraordinarily optimistic that we will, as an industry, rail development and public transport, seize this opportunity to put the resources that are going to be available to us to really good use effectively. There's no question that from a political standpoint, we tend to think of things in very short term. And so we have a 5-year bill now that provides these new resources for rail development and investment and public transport in the US. That's a short time. I think you would agree when we speak of infrastructure investment, we know what it takes to have to do the environmental reviews, to develop projects and to put them in the ground. So 5 years is very short-term thinking. But nevertheless, the industry understands that this is our opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to seize and to demonstrate the kinds of improvements and projects that we can put in place to help our communities continue to grow and help people expand their mobility options and address all the issues that we've been talking about this morning. So I remain very optimistic. I would caveat that out to say, though, that we also have great challenges in terms of workforce development and the right talents to be able to harness the improvements that we must make to really demonstrate the value that we provide. But I think we're up to it. And I know that as an industry, just in speaking to my colleagues, people are raring to go. So we're eager to put the resources to work and demonstrate what can be done to improve rail.
Thank you. Quick question for Martin. Paul showed us 3 potential high-speed projects in the States. Do you, and we noted your higher frequency rail initiative. Do you see any potential? Do you see anything in any prospect in the future of the S word coming in for high speed rail?
Wow, thanks, Anson. It's a tough one to answer, but I'd never heard that question before. I hear it every day. I hear it every single day. And you know what? High speed is the answer. I guess the question is, what is the question, right? And so it is an option, and it's an option we considered. But based on where we currently sit, you know, we look at how best to improve services and build a better future. And so we focused on, if you will, a quicker hit. So, you know, the advantage of high frequency rail is because we're leveraging available rights of way that we're going to be repurposing. It's quicker to market. It allows us to finally separate the passenger rail aspect from freight. But it also addresses some of our key shortcomings. It relates to scheduling, frequency of departures, far better on-time performance right now in our corridor services. On a good month, 70% of our trains are deemed to be on time, but that means 30% are late. And we can also improve on trip times with the current fleet that we're operating. So we think we get about 70% of the benefits for about 30% of the cost, but also more importantly, we do it much more quickly, and we build a base from which ultimately it could go faster, but we think it starts with frequency first.
Okay, I understand. Very quick question for Joubert, and apologies for the fact that we're out of time. But do you see metro operators coming out after the pandemic with more or less political support?
We need more political support.
We need more support.
Of course, we have already the participation in CapEx, in new projects of the private capital. But to the OpEx, we need to change two big points in Brazil. First one, federal government never gives money to mobility. It's an absurd. And second point, a lot of municipalities understand that the fare can cover 100% of the cost of the operations. It's a lie. You have to change these two concepts just now.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry to have to cut you off, and it's been a very good panel session and good discussion. So can I ask you all to join me in thanking the four panelists, Stephen, Martin, Paul, and Joubert. And I think the people in the audience will be putting their hands together, and we'll thank you very much for your participation. So I think we hand back now to our Master of Ceremonies.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you very much indeed, Anson. And indeed, there was more than just a ripple of applause of appreciation for that particular session, as there was an awful lot of very important messages passed there. And we look forward to the expansion of the high-speed work in America. That's very positive indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, we are running a little bit late. However, it is now time for a break. And we will take the 20 minutes that we had allocated because we've got to reset, recalibrate, and get ourselves ready for the next session, which will therefore start at 15:20. That's 3:20 French time, Paris time. So in approximately 20 minutes time, we'll have a short break, and thank you very much.